Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with the Dean. My name is Turney Stevens. I'm the Dean of the College of Business at Lipscomb University, and I'm welcoming to the campus today Tim Pagliara, who's the CEO of Cap Wealth Advisors. Congratulations on being named the best in the state, according to Barron's Magazine, Tim.
Well, thanks, Dean.
We're delighted to have you on the campus. It's an honor. But you're really here today because you're the co-chair of the Fix the Debt campaign here in Tennessee, along with former Governor Winfield Dunn, another friend of Lipscomb's. The Fix the Debt campaign does what, Tim?
It's a nonpartisan public awareness campaign to focus everyone's attention on solutions, to the national debt problem. It originated with the work that Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles did on the National Commission for Fiscal Responsibility and Reform that the President established in 2010. The report that they issued was put on the President's desk in December 2010, and they've continued to push these issues and public awareness since then.
Tim, this is such a highly politicized topic, and we're hearing about it daily. As we speak, the sequester is on everyone's mind and in the headlines. It seems to be an insurmountable problem, or at least it appears to be growing to the point where it's an insurmountable problem. By the middle of the next decade, I think the national debt, by one estimation, will be equal to 100% of the total economy of the United States. Is there any solution to this?
Oh, there's plenty of solutions, I think, but the first thing we have to do is stop politicizing it. And Fix the Debt through Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson started a new initiative that they even announced Monday, where we're going to create specific metrics and an understanding of just exactly what it takes to stabilize the debt. And then people can argue all the different ways of doing it, but you have to at least understand that what it takes to do that first. For example, you and I talked off camera when we got started, the $1.2 trillion that's coming in the sequester, that doesn't solve the problem. That just barely slows the rate of growth of government spending. So we have to give the American people and the politicians also an understanding of what exactly needs to be done, what a good deal looks like, and the different components of that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the sequester. I've got a chart here on my iPad from the Pew Research Center that shows that if the sequester actually happens and the cuts, quote unquote, that are scheduled to be implemented happen, that really only delays by 2 years the timeline on the increase in the debt that's projected, again, to be equal to 100% of the GDP by the middle of the next decade. And so really there's not as much effect from that as it's going to be required in order to really solve the problem. Is that an accurate understanding?
It's a very accurate understanding of it. All we're dealing with right now with the sequester in the $1.2 trillion in cuts is discretionary spending. This is there's three components to a solution to this problem in changing the rate of growth of government spending as a percentage of the economy. Discretionary spending is one, and the numbers actually, we have to come up with $2.4 trillion of real cuts. The second part of this is dealing with the social insurance, the entitlement program, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And then the third component of this is we have to have comprehensive tax reform and distribute the burden of taxes more equitably and reform our tax system to have it reflect the realities of a global marketplace. So that we've gotten locked in on this very political part of a very small portion of the problem. The only thing we paid for in the federal budget last year was Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. We borrowed everything else. Every dime of defense spending was borrowed. And as an example of the absurdity of this, we defend the Chinese or the Taiwanese in a defense treaty. We had to borrow the money for our defense. Half of it came from the Chinese, and we're defending the people of Taiwan against the Chinese. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things, and we're only dealing with, you know, a 40% of the problem. You can't solve any problem just dealing with 40% of it.
Well, just taking defense as an example, we'll talk about the other parts of this as the program progresses, but just taking defense as an example, my recollection is that we spend as much on defense as the next 40 or so countries combined spend, which is just almost beyond imagination. Now, it's nice that we have that level, I guess, of security, but is it really necessary to be able to wipe out the rest of the earth several times over?
I don't think so. You know, and the actual statistic, the top 13 nations in the world, including Russia and China, we spend more on defense than the top 13 nations combined, and probably the top 40.
Is
because
that may be the statistic. I may be misremembering that, but
right.
but that's
but
an
it probably
incredible.
Is, the bottom tier doesn't spend hardly anything, but it's an incredible number. And yes, we can cut. We have to reshape our military.
And yet we've seen this defense bureaucracy kick in over the last 2 or 3 weeks as the sequester has approached. We're seeing this incredible propaganda campaign that's coming out of the Pentagon saying, oh my gosh, we're going to fall off the edge of the earth if we have these cuts. We're going to have to furlough all these civilian workers. We're going to have to cut this. We're going to have to do that, and it's going to weaken our country. Is that just propaganda on the part of the defense establishment?
In part it is, but the whole idea of the sequester, the approach of just across-the-board cuts of a budget, no one would do that. You know, that needs to be done in a thoughtful way. It needs to be done as part of an overall plan. Because we lack the political will to do it, you know, this is what we're stuck with. And yeah, it is not smart. It's not smart at all, and it will lead to unintended consequences. But the hysteria that's surrounding it, no. You know, we're going to end up with cuts. They just need to be more thoughtful. You know, we don't need to be cutting investment in areas that we should be, you know, spending additional money on. But there are areas that are going to have to be cut.
Let's move to entitlements, and let's talk about Medicare and Social Security for just a moment. Interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal, I believe yesterday, talking about the fact that, well, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to raise taxes and then turn around and continue the same level of benefits for people that don't necessarily need that level of benefits to be able to pay their way. In other words, means testing. Right. Do you see that in the crystal ball? Is that inevitable that we're going to have means testing in this country?
Yes. And you know, when Social Security was established by Roosevelt, 50% of all the elderly were in poverty. Life expectancy was age 64, and benefits started at 65. Today, without Social Security, 40% of all Americans, elderly Americans, would be in poverty. So yes, we have to maintain that, but we have to reformulate benefits to take care of those in need. And Simpson-Bowles, Domenici, Rivlin, all these plans have got very thoughtful ways of doing that. Simpson-Bowles reformulates benefits so that someone working a minimum wage job for 30 years, they can retire at 125% of the poverty line. You know, we have to protect, you know, the poor in society, and this can be done, and it's one of the simple things that we can do now. Governor Bredesen said at the forum we had, you know, a few weeks ago here, you know, Social Security is the easy fix. You know, it's actuarial science. You know, they have the solutions to that. You know, Medicare and Medicaid, that's a much more difficult problem.
Well, let's go back to tax reform for a second, because there's a lot of talk about that. Of course, the Republican side of the aisle takes the position we do not want to increase taxes. The Democratic side of the aisle takes the position we don't want to decrease spending, and we do want to increase taxes to meet the gap. I have the brand new issue of The Economist here, just came out today, talking about the missing $20 trillion, which is the amount of taxes that the United States does not collect because of offshore transactions. What can we do to transform the tax codes in this country to keep them, to make them fair, and to help to make the gap smaller?
Well, one of the basic things that everyone has to understand is that there's a lot of spending in the tax code. They're called tax preferences. And in Simpson Bowles and others, they estimate that there's $1.2 trillion a year of spending in the tax code. That's everything from accelerated depreciation on assets that businesses acquire to excessive home mortgage interest deduction. And so we need to reformulate the tax code to make it fairer, for everyone. We can't create winners and losers based upon your ability to navigate through loopholes. So that's the first thing. The second thing is our tax code, and this is a big component of reform, has to reflect a global marketplace. We have the highest corporate tax rates in the world at 36%. Japan lowered theirs last year. We also approach taxation to the point where you take a company like Apple Computer, they have $138 billion in cash. 80 billion of it is in offshore companies, subsidiaries. They earned it there, they paid tax there. If they bring it back to the United States, it's 36% tax. So we've got a lot of money locked up. They estimate it's $1.7 trillion that is not available for savings and investment in this country unless there's an oppressive tax rate, put to it.
So that's one aspect of this. Now, another aspect I read the other day, and I don't want to pick on our friends at General Electric, but GE, I think, employs 180 some odd tax attorneys in their tax department. And last year, with revenues in the tens of billions of dollars, they paid zero in corporate taxes due to their ability to maneuver through the tax codes and through special legislation that protects them against the tax codes with special clauses and things that Congress has passed to protect their interest. Is that fair? Is that fair not only to other corporations but to the rest of us?
Well, no, to your point about the 180 tax attorneys, a lot of people don't know the IRS actually even has an office in their headquarters.
Is that right?
And they have people assigned, so they never get out of the audit process, and it's a constant battle. That should tell everybody a little bit about how we need some simplification in the tax code. We spend far too much energy on things like that. Part of why GE didn't pay any taxes is that they did it the hard way. They have a huge amount of tax loss carry forward from 2008 and 2009 when they had all the losses in their subsidiaries. But as a general rule, for companies like GE and Verizon Wireless that paid very little, if no any tax either, if they acquire an asset for expanding their business and it's a 30-year asset, they shouldn't be able to write it off over 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. That's how they drive their tax liability down, and through the use of leverage in that process. So streamlining the tax code would even out the tax liability of companies like GE when they are out of these cycles,
Now, one way they get some of those loopholes is through lobbying in Washington, riders that get attached to bills that really are totally irrelevant to taxes and to them, but they get these things added in at the last minute. So let's talk about campaign finance reform, because Governor Bredesen had a really interesting comment when I asked about this at the forum that you referred to here on the campus. He said perhaps the way to fix the debt is to fix campaign finance reform first, because we've got a Congress now that is so subject to campaign contributions. I won't go quite as far as using the word corrupt, but we're almost at that point, I think. So is the real underlying problem here the fact that the Congress can't take an objective view of this?
Oh, I think that's a big component of it. But behind all of those lobbyists that put the money into congressional campaigns and political campaigns is this constant push towards special interest spending, those very loopholes that we talk about. It's don't touch my loophole, and so they've got people that guard it. We started off talking about the military. Each branch of the military has their own lobbying organization, and they hit Capitol Hill.
And the defense contractors too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's, I think the way you choke it off is to simplify the code. It's like rebooting a computer that's gotten corrupted. You tear out all these loopholes, and then you selectively put back in, things like charitable contributions, a home mortgage deduction of $500,000, earned income credits, some things that protect the poor. That's what Simpson-Bowles contemplated. In doing that, you can reduce tax rates to 15 and 25%.
Well, let me play the devil's advocate for just a moment. So it's one thing to say, at least in theory, we need to strip all that out and start over. But really, Tim, how in the world will we ever get to that point, given the momentum that we have currently, the inertia that we currently have? I mean, do we need a constitutional amendment to throw all the rascals out and have a brand new Congress? I mean, is it going to come to that point?
Hopefully it won't. The old Winston Churchill quote, he said, you can count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And that's where we're at right now. And it goes back to the shift in policy at Fix the Debt. What is it going to take to solve this problem? It's not any one thing, it's a combination of things. And if we really focus on a solution to the problem and we call out the members of Congress and both parties, for the proposals that they're making as not being, directed towards a solution, then I think we'll start making some traction. But people have to understand what it's going to take to solve the problem. It's just like Fix the Debt through the Maya McGinnis, who's the executive director, and she's head of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget too. Probably the most knowledgeable person in Washington right now about budget matters. She called out the president just recently. 1.5 trillion in cuts will not solve that component of the problem. It has to be 2.4 or higher. And so we start getting the debate focused on that, the realization that the sequester doesn't accomplish anything. In fact, it's destructive because it's not smart. You need to, if you're going to cut, then you need to do that as part of an overall plan, and it has to be done in a thoughtful way, not just across the board. That's a coward's way of running a government.
Let me go back to the chart I referred to earlier in our conversation from the Pew Research organization. If you look at that chart and extend that out to mid-century, not just the mid-decades facing us, but mid-century, the current path will take us to a point where the U.S. debt is actually 250% of the projected size of the U.S. economy. That's uncharted territory. There are a few countries around the world that have reached 100%, but there are no solvent nations that I'm aware of that have ever reached 250% and survived. Is this an issue that threatens the very existence of the United States?
Yes, Greece melted down when their debt hit 140% of GDP. Erskine Bowles starts virtually every public speaking engagement that he has this way. He says, we are headed towards the most predictable economic crisis in history. And we are, unless we act. The financial markets will eventually step in and take over. We've got the lowest interest rates right now that we've ever measured. And the benchmark yield on a 2% 10-year treasury is 2%. Well, you take that to 4 or 5%, where it's been most of our business careers. Then you take the interest component on the debt from $220 billion a year to almost $1 trillion a year just by itself. So there are a lot of things in these projections that don't even discount what could happen if the financial markets say enough's enough.
Well, I could go even further than that. You and I are old enough to remember interest rates in the teens.
Absolutely.
And so that boggles the imagination to see what effect that would have if we relive the Carter era again today. We would be, beyond hope from that standpoint. If you go back in history and look at other nations, other civilizations that have gone through extreme reactions like we may be facing, you see some pretty dire outcomes. Crisis usually is the inevitable result. We saw what happened in the German nation after World War I that precipitated the rise of the Nazis in World War II. Could we ever get to a point in this country where the government is overthrown and where martial law is put into place because we can't seem to control our own spending?
I doubt that it would come to that, but the misery that would be reflected in the people that control our political process, we would have a lot of political change at that point. And right now, you know, this debt problem and lack of growth in the economy, it's an insidious thing, and people don't really understand what's happening to them. And, you know, I talk to a lot of young people, and I reflect back on when I was in school. You know, in 1979, when I was in law school, right before I entered, I was working in a grocery store. I made $9 an hour. My tuition, the first year of law school, was $5,000. You know, today, those kids are still making that kind of money, working part-time jobs.
That's right.
And their tuition's much higher, and their dollars don't go where they used to go in terms of their purchasing power. And that's symptomatic of a country that's not growing, that's in debt. We have fewer and fewer options than we did. You know, it's just like a family that's saddled with a lot of debt. They don't have the discretionary income to do things that they could do, to pull themselves out and invest and save. So we're here. We're feeling the effects of it. People just are not putting the label on it, and it's.
Yeah, to your point, I had lunch yesterday with an executive of a public company based here in Nashville. They have 250 some odd retail stores around the country. And in reaction to Obamacare, they've made the decision that they'll have one full-time employee per store, and everybody else will be 30 hours or less. Every other person will be off benefits other than what's required, you know, from Obamacare. And so that changes dramatically the prospects for our students coming out of school. You know, if everybody adopts that position. So there are a lot of unintended consequences going on here that could be disastrous, I think, for the economy.
That's why this whole focus right now on the sequester, you know, it's so misguided. We need to get past that, and we need to be focusing on the tax reform and the policies that'll reestablish growth. None of these projections are going to work unless we grow the economy. We can't grow the economy at 1.5% and solve our problem and ever get out of this debt.
No doubt about it, no doubt. And as we've traveled through China the last 3 or 4 years with our students, I've just been absolutely amazed at what's going on around the rest of the world, and we grossly underestimate how fast the rest of the world is growing and what it means to grow at the rate of 1 or 2% here in terms of long-term implications. Let me go back to Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson's commission for just a second. Now, this was a plan that was actually commissioned by the president, if I'm not mistaken. And if I could put it in its simplest terms, basically what they came up with was what I might call a moderate course, a compromise that basically said we've got to tax a little more than the Republicans would like to tax. We've got to spend a little less than the Democrats want to spend, and we'll find a middle ground here. Is that a fair summation? Maybe that's an oversimplification, but is that a fair summation of their plan?
It is. There were 17 members of that commission. 11 of them voted for it, including Dick Durbin, who's a very bright senator out of Illinois, Democrat. It was very bipartisan across the aisle. Some of the members that didn't vote for it, like Paul Ryan, didn't think it did enough to address the drivers of some of the problems in healthcare, you know, in our debt problem. But that's exactly it. And it focused on maintaining the economic recovery, maintaining our commitment, you know, to people in poverty, and establishing, you know, a growth pattern, you know, and policies that would lead to a growth pattern that would help us get out of this. But central to it, you know, was big spending cuts, spending reform that would keep Congress from coming back and backsliding on, there was a complete structure in place for that. And then tax reform, you know, and big component of it was tax reform, as well as, you know, entitlement reform.
So why did the president say, I want this plan, and then totally ignore it?
That's a great question. You know, why hasn't the president presented a budget this year yet?
Yeah. Well, for several years.
For several years, including this year, as we approach the sequester.
Despite a constitutional requirement to do that.
Right. You know, he didn't have the political will to sell it to his constituency. You know, when you run on a platform that if you just raise taxes a slight amount, make the rich pay a little bit more, and you solve the problem, what happens when you get what you wish for? It hasn't solved the problem. It's not even close. And so the president needs to come to Congress. They need to sit down together, and that hasn't happened yet. So it's a very strange game that I don't understand. You know, you and I couldn't, you know, do this in business. You certainly wouldn't teach your students that way either.
Well, no, and it's very unfortunate because it's creating a generation of cynics. The students today are very cynical about our system, and they're very, very concerned about their ability to function in our system. Interestingly enough, it's creating more of an entrepreneurial initiative on the part of the students. I think that's one of the things that's driving the interest in entrepreneurial initiatives, not just on our campus, but on many campuses, because the students have watched their dads being downsized, their moms being downsized, and they're very interested in not being put into that position and being able to make a job as opposed to finding a job. So that's a positive outcome, I think, of our culture today. But it's a very unfortunate thing for the students to be as cynical as they are about their prospects, and I'm very concerned about that. Let's talk about the Fix the Debt campaign. I know that you're a volunteer in that effort, and I suspect you would like to enlist some additional volunteers. What can the rest of us do to try to make a difference in all of this?
They can go to the website, which is fixthedebt.org, all one word. They can sign up, receive the emails, start getting in the loop of education. There are daily briefings that go out, you know, about some aspect of what is going on in Washington as they try and push this initiative forward. It's educational. There is a format in there where they can write their congressman, you know, and other public officials to make them aware that they're now aware and they want a real solution to the problem. Part of all this, in this educational progress, is giving congressmen the courage to come out and address these problems, you know, and when there's enough public awareness and consensus that some of these things have to change, then they're going to be more willing to tackle the tough issues. Because I guarantee you, there's going to be something in this that everybody's going to hate to solve this problem. And that is what a good solution is going to look like.
Well, isn't that the definition of a negotiated deal, though?
Right.
I mean, there's something that you don't like about the deal, or it wouldn't be a fair and negotiated deal.
Yeah.
But we can't seem to get to that point, and I think that's what's so frustrating to the rest of us, you know, who watch this from the sidelines. Are you satisfied that our congressional representatives are on the right side of this issue?
I'll approach that in the positive. I think Senator Corker gets it, and it has just been a real champion and a breath of fresh air. I think Congressman Cooper really gets it. You know, he understands the budget as well as or better than anybody in Congress. So they really are doing a fabulous job. And I think the rest of our representatives need to step it up a little bit, you know, in throwing down some of their ideology and handling, you know, the problem. One of our representatives is quoted as always saying, we don't have a taxing problem, we've got a spending problem. Well, we have both.
Sure.
You know, we just looked at it, you know, in the article you flashed up from The Economist. Where's that $20 trillion? You know, so we have both. Yeah, and you have to address it that way. That's got to be part of the compromise. And if you don't believe that, then you ought to step aside, you know, at this point.
Tim, thanks for being at Lipscomb today. It's always an honor to have you on the campus.
Well, I enjoyed it.
I appreciate your friendship. My guest today has been Tim Pagliara, who's the CEO of Cap Wealth Advisors. But probably more importantly, and the reason he's here today is because he's the co-chair of the Fix the Debt campaign here in Tennessee. Thanks for joining us on Conversations with the Dean. We'll see you next time.